inside a wax-sealed envelope of mortgage lifter tomato seeds my father left me, I found the original notarized contract that proved my stepdaughter had forged my signature and tried to sell my life's work out from under me. Today, she hand-labels jars in my kitchen wearing an apron that reads "rotten to the core," and every single label prints the probate fraud docket number right above the ingredients list. But before any of that happened, I had to become a ghost in her own home for 63 days, pick a flat tumbler filing cabinet lock with a barbie pin and a tension wrench I made from a binder clip, and fake my own cardiac collapse on a kitchen floor just to confirm that the woman I had raised from 12 years old would step over my dying body to grab a financial document. My name is Margaret, and for 28 years I was a registered nurse on a cardiac step-down unit at St. Joseph's Regional, the kind of nurse who could read a telemetry strip from across the room and spot a potassium imbalance before the lab results came back. I worked double shifts through 2 recessions, skipped vacations, and ate more meals from a vending machine than I can count, all so I could cash out an $89,000 nursing pension and pour every cent of it into something that would outlast me. My father, Tom, was a man who talked to his tomatoes the way other men talk to their dogs. He spent his entire retirement on a half-acre plot behind his farmhouse in southern Ohio, breeding heritage tomato strains with the patience of a monk. His prize was the mortgage lifter he'd been stabilizing since 1998, a beefsteak variety that routinely pushed individual fruits past 2¼ pounds with a Brix sugar level between 9 and 11, which in the gourmet sauce world is the difference between a condiment and an heirloom ingredient that chefs will pay $34 a jar to put on their menus. When I left the hospital, my plan was precise: a licensed seed-saving library with a germination testing station, a humidity-controlled drying room, and a USDA-inspected commercial kitchen built into a converted pole barn on my father's property. I brought my stepdaughter Claire in as a 50-50 partner. She was 29 years old, sharp as a tack with social media and brand packaging, and she had the kind of easy confidence that makes investors nod before they've even heard the numbers. We sat down in my father's kitchen on a Friday afternoon in September, the windows open and the whole house smelling like ripe fruit and basil, and we notarized a partnership contract right there at the old oak table while my father watched from his recliner. He had a wool blanket across his lap even though it was 70 degrees, his hands trembling the way they did in his last year, but his eyes were clear. He watched me sign, then Claire, then the notary embossed the page with her foil seal and wrote her commission number in the ledger. My father nodded once and said, "Now it's got roots." I thought he meant the business. I should have known he meant something else entirely. My husband, Claire's father, had been a quiet architect who designed the slatted pine shelving in the pantry and the passive solar orientation of the germination room, but he never understood money the way a spreadsheet understands arithmetic. He passed away 3 years before any of this, leaving behind a gentle absence and a set of blueprints I still keep in a flat file. I thought I was building a legacy that would hold the 3 of us together, my father's genetics and Claire's marketing, and my own clinical precision, sealed with a signature and a piece of raised notary foil. I was wrong about almost all of it. My father died on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of May, his heart giving out while he was pruning the mortgage lifter row with the same carbon steel shears he had sharpened every spring since 1974. I found him in the dirt, his overalls still dusted with yellow pollen, one hand resting on the stake that held the label for row 7. I sat down next to him and held his hand until the ambulance came, and I remember thinking that the soil under my knees was still warm from the sun, and that he would have wanted it exactly this way in the field among the plants he had spent a lifetime teaching to thrive. By Wednesday morning, before I had even picked out the clothes for his funeral, the vultures had landed. Claire arrived first, pulling up in a new Lexus I didn't recognize with a temporary plate still taped in the rear window. Her husband Brad was driving, a man who wore polished Oxford loafers with no socks and talked about brand identity as if it were a living creature you could buy with the right pitch deck. They wrapped me in a cashmere blanket I'd never seen before and murmured all the right phrases, their voices dripping with manufactured sympathy. Brad poured me a cup of tea I didn't ask for and set it on the side table with 2 sugars, even though I've never taken sugar in my tea, a fact Claire absolutely knew because she used to make it for me when she was a teenager. Within 2 hours, Brad was walking the property with a yellow legal pad, counting the number of raised beds and asking about irrigation rights and whether the organic certification paperwork was current. Claire knelt beside my chair and took both my hands in hers, her palms cool and dry, and she said we needed to go through my father's things right away to secure the assets before anyone else gets any ideas. I let them do it because my grief was a fog so dense I couldn't see my own reflection in it. They moved through my father's small house like liquid finding a crack, opening drawers and closets and cupboards, tossing things into plastic bins with a speed that felt rehearsed. Brad pulled a shoebox from the back of the hallway closet, shook it, heard the rustle of paper envelopes and said, "More of those old seed packets. Just junk, Tom and his endless envelopes, toss it." He held the box out to Claire without even looking inside, and she dropped the entire thing into a black contractor bag that already held a wet coffee filter and a broken egg timer and something sticky I didn't want to identify. I sat in my father's recliner, a blanket pulled up to my chin, and I watched the shoebox tumble into the bag with a soft thud. I didn't say a single word. I waited until they were both in the kitchen, their heads bent together over a laptop, their voices low and urgent, and then I eased myself out of the chair as quietly as I could, walked to the bag and fished the shoebox out of the wet mess. The cardboard was damp along one edge, and it smelled faintly of coffee grounds, but the contents were intact. I slid the box under my jacket, pressing it flat against my ribs, and I carried it to my car and locked it in the trunk before anyone noticed I had moved. Inside that shoebox were most of my father's active breeding lines, little hand-labeled envelopes of Cherokee purple and Brandywine and green zebra, and a dozen experimental crosses he'd coded with numbers only he understood. But at the very bottom, pressed flat against the cardboard so it was almost invisible, was a heavier packet made of brown craft paper, the kind they used to sell at the feed store in the 60s. It was sealed with a disc of red wax no bigger than a dime, the wax old and brittle and shot through with tiny cracks. On the front, in my father's uneven cursive, it read Mortgage Lifter 1998. I could feel through the paper that it held more than just seeds. There was the stiff crinkle of folded paper, something dense and deliberate, and I knew without opening it that my father had left me a message. I didn't open it until that night, alone in my own kitchen at my own house, with the back door locked and the curtains drawn and my hands still smelling faintly of pollen from his field. The red wax cracked under my thumbnail with a sound like a tiny bone snapping. I slid out the contents one at a time. First, 12 pale seeds the color of old ivory, each one plump and viable, the embryo visible as a dark shadow inside the seed coat. And then a single folded sheet of onion skin typing paper, the kind they used for carbon copies in legal offices 40 years ago, thin as a butterfly wing and just as fragile. I unfolded it carefully, my breath held tight in my chest, and I saw the original notarized partnership contract, the one Claire and I had signed in my father's kitchen, with our signatures at the bottom in blue ballpoint and the notary seal still perfectly embossed, the foil still raised and gleaming. But what stopped my heart was not the contract itself, it was the marginalia. In the bottom corner of the page, written in the same soft pencil my father had used to label his wooden seed trays, were the words, "M. If you're reading this, Claire is not what she seems. Do not sign anything. Save the seeds, save yourself. I set a tripwire. If she tries to sell, the whole thing locks tighter than a mason jar in a hot water bath. Trust the seeds, and trust the trust." He had signed it with a tiny stick figure tomato, the same little drawing he'd doodled on birthday cards since I was a child. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time, the contract spread in front of me, and I felt my grief shift into something colder and more focused. My father had seen this coming. He had known, maybe for years, and instead of confronting anyone he had quietly, methodically, built a countermeasure and hidden it in the one place nobody would ever look. A packet of seeds his golden child granddaughter had already dismissed as worthless junk. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who will try to steal your harvest right out of the soil while you're still grieving at the fence line. Now back to the moment everything began to accelerate. Claire and Brad didn't waste a single day after the funeral. The service was on a Friday, brief and sparse, and by Saturday evening they were seated at my dining table with a leather portfolio and a stack of documents fanned out like a winning poker hand. Claire had dressed in a soft grey cardigan, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail that made her look younger, more innocent, and she kept her voice pitched low and soothing, almost maternal. She explained that I was in no state to manage a business, that grief does things to the prefrontal cortex, that decision-making capacity can be impaired for months after a major loss, and that the kindest thing she could do as my partner was to take over the books and the licensing and the day-to-day operations so I wouldn't have to lift a finger. Brad sat beside her, nodding along, his posture perfect. his smile a fixed and unnerving crescent. He pushed a stack of papers across the table toward me, tapping them with a Montblanc pen that probably cost more than my first month's nursing salary. There were 3 documents. The first was a durable power of attorney that would give Claire complete legal authority over all my financial accounts, real property, and business interests. The second was a partnership dissolution agreement that would formally sever my 50% ownership stake and assign it to a new entity Brad had already incorporated, something called Heartland Heritage Foods LLC, which had been registered with the Ohio Secretary of State 3 weeks before my father died. The third was an asset transfer instrument that would convey the seed library, the source recipes, the trademark application, and the entire physical inventory of jarred product to Heartland Heritage Foods for a one-time payment described in the document as a caretaker's stipend. I looked at the number on the line, $3,200. They had even printed a check and clipped it to the corner of the page, already signed by Claire and dated for the following Monday, as if my signature were a mere formality. Brad leaned forward and said, "We're just protecting you from the wolves, Margaret. You built this with your own 2 hands. We want to make sure nobody takes it while you're down." His voice was smooth as a polished river stone, but I noticed his right thumb was tapping a rhythm on the table leg, fast and nervous, the way a patient's pulse spikes when they are lying about their chest pain. I looked at Claire, and she smiled at me with an expression so tender it made my stomach clench. She said, "I just want to take care of you, Mom." She hadn't called me Mom in 10 years. I did what every experienced cardiac nurse learns to do when a combative patient is sundowning, and you need to de-escalate without restraints. I played foggy and slow and confused. I blinked a lot, asked them to repeat the names of the entities 3 times, tilted my head and said, "I'm sorry, my brain just isn't firing on all cylinders right now." I kept both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, letting my fingers tremble slightly. I told them I needed a few days to think, that I couldn't even remember where I'd put my checkbook, that the paperwork looked so complicated, and my head was full of static. Brad's jaw tightened, the muscles at the hinge flexing, but Claire placed a hand on his arm and said, "Of course, take all the time you need." Then she offered the final piece, the trap dressed in a cashmere throw. I should move into their guest suite so I wouldn't be alone in my grief. They had a beautiful room with an en-suite bathroom and a garden view. They could keep an eye on my medication, make sure I was eating, and I could heal surrounded by family. It was a control tactic, pure and simple, a way to isolate me from my neighbors and my friends and my own knowledge of my own house, but it was also my best chance to get inside their walls and find out exactly what they were doing and how far it went. I said yes as if it were the kindest offer I had ever received, and by Sunday night, my clothes were hanging in their guest closet, and my passport and my father's sealed seed packet were hidden under the mattress inside a slit I cut in the bark's spring lining. For the first 2 weeks I acted like a ghost with low blood pressure brain fog, drifting from room to room in slippers, pretending to nap on the sofa while I listened with every fibre of my attention. Their house was a split-level colonial with an open floor plan and thin interior walls, and from the guest room I could hear Brad's phone calls through the heating vent that connected to his office downstairs. There were a lot of frantic calls, the kind that start with "I need an extension" and end with "I don't care what the underwriter said, find another lender." He would start loud, his voice carrying up through the ductwork, and then drop to an urgent hiss when Claire shushed him from the kitchen. But I caught specific words floating through the vent like dust motes. "Third quarter close, contingency removal, the lender won't float this another week." One afternoon I heard him nearly shout, "The organic conglomerate is ready to wire 580, but I cannot get the title cleared without her signature. The title company keeps kicking it back, because of that stupid trust." That was the first time I heard the word trust spoken in their house, and I filed it away like a lab result that confirms a diagnosis you've been dreading. Over the next several days I pieced together that Verdant Horizon Organics, a mid-size organic foods conglomerate out of Northern California, had made a formal written offer of $580,000 for my source brand and the entire mortgage lifter seed collection and all associated intellectual property. The offer was contingent on full ownership transfer with no outstanding liens and no cloud on the title. But something in the title search kept flagging my father's name, and they needed me to sign a quitclaim and a dissolution to make the flag go away. That's what the paperwork on my dining table had really been about. While I drifted through the upstairs hallway pretending to be lost in grief, I watched their financial life spiral in real time. A new black Escalade appeared in the garage with a temporary paper plate taped in the window, the factory sticker still glued to the passenger glass. Claire came home with glossy shopping bags from Williams-Sonoma and Sur La Table, talking loudly about a photo shoot for the Source Line's website redesign. I heard Brad on the phone with a debt collector one night at 11 o'clock, his voice shaking with the effort of staying calm, saying, "I will have the payment by the 15th, I swear on my mother's life." A few days later, I found a final notice from their mortgage lender stuffed behind the toaster oven, the envelope already opened, the bold red text warning of acceleration and foreclosure if the past due amount wasn't paid within 30 days. They were hemorrhaging money they didn't have, funding a lifestyle on the expectation of a payout that hadn't arrived and might never arrive, and I was the only obstacle standing between them and the wire transfer that would plug every hole. Then I found the shredder. It sat in the corner of Brad's home office, a cross-cut model you can buy at any office supply store, and every morning it was fuller than the night before, the bin overflowing with thin curls of confetti. The housekeeper came on Tuesdays and Fridays, which meant I had windows of time when the shredded documents were still in the bin. I started retrieving them before dawn, scooping handfuls of paper strips into a pillowcase and carrying them back to my closet, where I knelt on the carpet and pieced them together by the light of a small LED book lamp. It was painstaking work, the kind of tedious precision I'd learned years ago when I had to hand-record patient vitals every 50 minutes during a nocturnal telemetry crisis. I matched the curl of one strip to another, aligning numbers and fonts and letterhead logos, taping the fragments onto sheets of printer paper. Over the course of 12 nights, I reconstructed 3 complete documents. The first was a promissory note for $240,000, secured against all the assets of Heartland Heritage Foods, and personally guaranteed with a signature that was supposed to be mine. The loop on the capital M in Margaret was too tight, and the slant of the T-cross was rising left to right instead of falling. I had signed enough consent forms and prescription logs in my career to know my own signature like a hymn, and this one was a forgery. A good forgery, good enough to fool a bank officer who had never seen the original, but not good enough to survive a forensic handwriting analyst. The second document was a UCC-1 financing statement filed with the Secretary of State, listing the entire seed library and source inventory as collateral for a revolving line of credit from a commercial lender in Columbus. They were draining equity from a business I still legally half-owned, and if the debt went bad, the bank would seize my father's seeds and sell them at auction to the highest bidder. The third document was a letter from a local probate attorney confirming that once I signed the dissolution, all residual claims I had to the intellectual property registration would be extinguished, and I could be legally removed as a co-owner of the brand. They were setting me up as the scapegoat for their debt, planning to strip the assets, default on the loans, and leave me holding the personal guarantee while they walked away with the conglomerate's cash. I sat on the floor of that closet with my heart beating hard and slow, and I realized I was living inside a financial crime scene. The kitchen drawer broke on a Thursday afternoon, and that was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being the person who would dismantle them. It was a standard side-mount drawer track under the main counter. The nylon roller wheel on the left rail had cracked clean through, and the drawer was hanging at a 30-degree angle, spilling spatulas and wooden spoons onto the floor. Claire stood in the middle of the kitchen holding a butter knife, actually trying to jam the track back into place with the wrong tool, and absolutely no mechanical sense. Brad was leaning against the refrigerator, scrolling through his phone, muttering about calling a handyman, and neither of them had any idea what to do. I stepped forward, pulled a small flathead screwdriver from my purse, an old habit from the days when I carried a multi-tool to fix the frayed cables on patient monitors and the sticky wheels on Roman 4 poles, and I removed the track bracket from the cabinet, filed down the bent metal tab against the stone countertop, reset the nylon roller into its groove, and remounted the entire assembly in under 40 seconds. The drawer slid in and out smooth as butter. Claire's mouth opened and closed, and she said, "I didn't know you could do that." I wiped the screwdriver on my jeans and said, 28 years on a cardiac floor teaches you that the most expensive piece of equipment in the room is the nurse who can fix anything with tape and patience. I've intubated a crashing patient with a ballpoint pen and a pocket knife. A drawer is not a challenge. That moment carved a tiny crack in their perception of me. I saw it flicker across Brad's face. The realization that the foggy, grieving old woman they'd been pushing around used to be a highly competent professional who could stay calm under pressure nobody in that kitchen could imagine. But it also reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten about myself. I was not just my father's daughter. I was a nurse who had held lives together with nothing more than skill and nerve, and I decided right then that I would use every single skill I possessed to burn their entire scheme to the ground. The following Monday, Brad and Claire left for a meeting with the acquisition team at Verdant Horizon's regional office in Indianapolis, a 3-hour drive each way. They told me they'd be back by dinner, and as soon as their car cleared the end of the driveway, I went into Brad's office. The filing cabinet was a 2-drawer Hahn vertical, the kind you see in 1,000 small offices, with a single wafer tumbler lock cylinder in the top right corner. I knelt down and examined it. The lock was a flat wafer design, not a tubular or a disc detainer, which meant it could be bypassed with a tension wrench and a short hook. I hadn't picked a lock in over 30 years, not since I worked the night shift on a rehab unit, and a paraplegic patient named Walter, a retired locksmith who had lost the use of his legs but none of his manual dexterity, taught me the basics as a way to keep his fingers moving and his mind sharp. He used to say, "The difference between a lock and a locked door is just a conversation with the wafers. You have to ask them nicely, one at a time." Walter's voice came back to me as I knelt on that office carpet, and I went to work. I didn't have a proper pick set, so I made my own. I broke the black plastic handle off a binder clip from Brad's desk and bent the metal arm into a 90-degree angle to form a tension wrench. Then I took a bobby pin from my hair, straightened it with my teeth, and filed the tip against the rough stone of the bathroom vanity to create a shallow rake. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied gentle rotational pressure, just enough to bind the first wafer. With the bobby pin hook, I worked each wafer individually, lifting it until I felt the faint click as the wafer cleared the shear line and the plug rotated a fraction of a degree. It took me 8 minutes and 40 seconds, my ear pressed close to the cold metal, listening for the tiny sounds of each wafer setting. When the final wafer clicked, the plug turned, and the drawer rolled open with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. Inside, in a hanging folder labeled Acquisition, I found everything I needed. There was the formal letter of intent from Verdant Horizon Organics, offering $580,000 for the brand and the seed collection, contingent on clean title and full ownership transfer within 45 days. There was the forged dissolution agreement with the signature that wasn't mine, attached to a notarized affidavit Brad had drafted himself, claiming I was mentally incapacitated and unable to manage my own affairs. There was the original promissory note and the filed UCC one, and a letter from the probate attorney outlining exactly how they could remove me as co-owner and liquidate the assets. But the real discovery was a letter tucked at the very back of the folder, on letterhead from the Greenbelt Seed Trust, a non-profit agricultural repository based in Geneva, New York. The letter was dated 4 months before my father's death, and it was addressed to Brad. The trust manager, a man named David Adler, wrote that the mortgage lifter seed collection and its associated trademark were held in a co-ownership trust established under the 2018 Plant Variety Protection Act, a specialized legal structure designed to protect heirloom agricultural genetics from commercial exploitation. The trust listed my father and me as joint co-owners, with a survivorship provision that passed full ownership to me alone upon my father's death. But the critical detail was a clause buried in the trust's governing document, a contestation provision that automatically froze all transfers, sales, liens, or encumbrances the moment any registered co-owner filed a written dispute with the trust administrator. The trust couldn't be broken, the seeds couldn't be sold, and the trademark couldn't be reassigned, not without my live signature in front of a notary, a government-issued photo ID, and a contemporaneous video recording proving I was signing voluntarily and with full capacity. My father had sat in his recliner with that wool blanket across his lap and watched Claire notarize our partnership, and then he had quietly gone to a seed trust in upstate New York and built a legal dead man switch that would freeze the entire enterprise if anyone tried to steal it from me. David Adler had been writing to Brad for weeks, requesting documentation of my signature, and Brad had been dodging his calls and emails, spinning a story about my fragile mental state and promising paperwork that never arrived. The sale to Verdant Horizon couldn't close without a release from the trust, and the trust wouldn't release without a video of me saying yes, and I was never going to say yes. My father had planted a countermeasure years before the storm even formed on the horizon. I called David Adler from a prepaid phone I bought with cash at a gas station outside town, the kind of phone you can buy without showing ID. We arranged to meet in the parking lot of a defunct nursery off State Route 41, a place with a collapsed greenhouse and a faded sign that had once advertised hanging baskets. He was a compact man in his early 60s, wearing a canvas jacket and a cap with a seed company logo, and he had soil under his fingernails that looked like it had been there for decades. We sat in his truck, the engine off and the windows cracked, and I handed him the original contract and my father's note. He read it twice, then looked at me and said, "Your father came to see me 2 summers ago. He brought me a paper bag of mortgage lifter fruit and a story about a stepdaughter who had asked him to sign an assignment of the trademark, told him it was just an insurance form. He didn't sign. Instead, he asked me to build the tightest trust structure I could construct under the Plant Variety Protection Act. He wanted something that would lock up tighter than a seed vault the instant anyone tried to move the assets without you. We designed it together over 3 afternoons. He knew Margaret. He knew exactly what she was." Adler told me he had already filed a suspicious activity report with the Agricultural Fraud Division of the State Attorney General's office because the sheer volume of forged documents Brad had been floating through the banking system had triggered several compliance flags. But the investigators needed one final piece of evidence to make an arrest stick. They needed a live demonstration that Claire and Brad were trying to coerce my signature, that they would walk me into a location and attempt to force my consent. Adler asked if I could get them to do exactly that, and if I would be willing to let law enforcement be waiting in the room. I said yes without hesitation. But before I set that final trap, I needed to know if there was any shred of humanity left in the woman I had helped raise since she was 12 years old, the girl I had taught to make tomato sauce from scratch on Saturday mornings, the teenager I had driven to volleyball practice and college visits, and her first job interview. I needed to know if the person who called me Mom when she wanted something still existed underneath all the debt and the desperation. So I staged a maximum cruelty test on the following afternoon. I have a documented history of vasovagal syncope, a benign condition where sudden emotional or physical stress triggers an overactive vagal response, dropping my blood pressure and heart rate until I briefly lose consciousness. It's happened maybe 6 times in my adult life, always during periods of extreme strain, and I know exactly how to trigger it manually using a forced Valsalva maneuver. You take a shallow breath, close your glottis the way you do when you're bearing down to lift something heavy, and you compress your thoracic cavity until the venous return to your heart plummets and your brain temporarily loses perfusion. I had done it once by accident during a difficult intubation and memorized the physical sequence. That afternoon I stood in Claire's kitchen while she was scrolling her phone at the island, a half-empty latte beside her and the afternoon light slanting through the window. I positioned myself in her direct line of sight, took a short breath, and bore down hard against my closed airway, my diaphragm pushing against my lungs while my abdominal muscles clenched. Within 12 seconds my vision began to grey out from the periphery, tunneling down to a pinhole, and my knees buckled. I collapsed sideways onto the tile floor, my right shoulder and hip taking the impact, and I lay there completely limp, one arm thrown out, my breathing shallow and irregular. Through my half-closed eyelashes, I watched Claire look up from her phone. She stared at my body on the floor with an expression I will never forget, not surprise or fear or concern, but mild irritation, as if I had interrupted something mildly important. She walked over to me, her flats making a soft sound on the tile, and she did not check my pulse. She did not put her fingers to my carotid or compress my sternum or call an ambulance. She stepped directly over my body, one foot on either side of my motionless arm, and reached for the manila folder I had deliberately left on the counter behind me. She opened it, scanned the fake dissolution document I had placed inside as bait, and I heard her mutter to herself in a flat, clinical voice, "You're not dying on me yet, Margaret. You still have to sign these papers." Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me on the cold tile floor, my heart pounding from the Valsalva rebound and my eyes burning with an anger so pure it felt like oxygen. That was the exact moment every residual ounce of family loyalty I had ever felt for Claire Elizabeth Kellerman evaporated like water dropped onto a hot cast-iron pan. I had needed to know, and now I knew. There was nothing left to protect. The next morning, a Saturday, Claire came into my guest room with a cup of tea and her soft grey cardigan, and told me we were going to take a little drive to the office of a business attorney who would walk us through the closing paperwork and make sure everything was simple and clean. Brad was already outside with the car running. They thought they were marching me to a final signing appointment, a single clean swoop where I would notarize the dissolution, sign the quitclaim, and record the video release for the trust, all at once, after which I would be financially useless to them, and they would discard me the way they had discarded my father's seed barks. What they didn't know was that David Adler was already inside that office suite. So were two investigators from the state's Agricultural Crime Unit, a uniformed sheriff's deputy who specialized in elder financial exploitation, and a notary public with a video camera already set up and recording. The office was a glass-front suite in a strip mall near the interstate, the kind of place that rents by the hour to attorneys who don't want a permanent address. I walked through the door with Claire's hand gripping my elbow a little too tightly, Brad flanking us at the rear. The suite was cold and smelled of toner and old carpet. A conference table dominated the main room, and I saw David Adler seated at one end, a laptop open in front of him, a small notary cam tripod aimed at the empty chair across from him. Brad stood off to the side, grinning the same car salesman grin, and he said, "Well, here we are. Easy as pie. Margaret, just a few signatures and we're all taken care of." Claire slid the papers across the table, the dissolution and the quitclaim and the trust release, all neatly stacked, and she put a pen in my right hand. Her voice was syrup, warm and smooth and absolutely poisonous. "Just sign, sweetheart," she said, "and all this weight goes away. You'll be free." I set the pen down on the table with a click that sounded louder than a gunshot. The room went silent. Brad's grin froze and then slid off his face like melting wax. Claire's eyes widened, her composure cracking for just a fraction of a second. I looked straight at her, and I said the line I had rehearsed 100 times in the dark of her guest room, the line that had kept me alive through 63 days of silent surveillance and shredded paper, and the memory of my father's handwriting in red wax. "You forgot one thing, Claire. My father never trusted you either. He saw you coming 2 summers ago, and he built a tripwire you couldn't even see. The seeds are already frozen, and the trust will never release without my consent, which you will never, ever get." At that exact moment, David Adler pressed a button on his phone, and the side door to the suite swung open. The sheriff's deputy stepped out first, a tall woman with a braid pinned under her campaign hat and her hand resting on her duty belt. Behind her came the 2 agricultural crime investigators, one of them a woman with a tight bun and a badge on a lanyard, the other a man in a sport coat carrying a digital recorder. The lead investigator announced in a voice that filled the entire room that Claire and Brad were being detained on charges of felony forgery, elder financial exploitation by a caregiver, fraudulent transfer of agricultural assets, and conspiracy to commit theft by deception. Brad made a strangled noise and tried to bolt toward the back exit, but the deputy was fast, stepping into his path and taking him down to the carpet with a controlled compliance hold that looked almost gentle. Claire started screaming, her voice tearing through the room, calling me an ungrateful, scheming, manipulative hag who was throwing away the best thing that had ever happened to the business. As the deputy cuffed her wrists behind her back, she kept screaming, her face contorted into something unrecognizable, and I realized I was looking at a stranger wearing my stepdaughter's skin. I didn't scream back. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out the original notarized contract with my father's marginalia, the onion skin paper trembling slightly in my fingers, and I held it up like a specimen slide under a microscope. The forged signatures next to my real one, the notary seal that didn't match the notary's own records, the timeline that proved they had incorporated Heartland Heritage Foods 3 weeks before my father even died. It was all there, and the investigators saw it in a single glance. The aftermath unspooled over the following 6 months with the slow precision of a legal system doing exactly what it is designed to do. A forensic audit, commissioned by the State Attorney General's office and paid for by the Seed Trust's Legal Defense Fund, uncovered over $312,000 in personally guaranteed debt that Claire and Brad had taken out in my name across 4 different financial institutions. Because the Greenbelt Seed Trust had frozen the assets the instant my dispute was filed, none of that debt could attach to the seed library, or the source brand, or the physical property in any way. The promissory note was declared void ab initio by a district court judge, meaning it had never legally existed due to the foundational fraud. The UCC-1 financing statement was struck from the public record. Verdant Horizon Organics withdrew their acquisition offer the day after the arrests hit the local news, citing a material adverse change in ownership integrity, a clause their own lawyers had built into the term sheet. That withdrawal was a gift I hadn't expected. It meant I didn't have to fight a conglomerate with a war chest of legal resources, and I could rebuild the brand entirely on my own terms. Brad accepted a plea deal 4 months after his arrest, avoiding a jury trial by pleading guilty to 1 count of conspiracy and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 14 months in a county detention facility, plus a restitution order for $87,000, which was his traceable share of the fraud. Claire, who the forensic evidence clearly identified as the mastermind, the one who had forged the signatures and orchestrated the incorporation and the promissory note, was convicted at trial on 3 counts of felony forgery, 1 count of felony elder abuse, and 1 count of fraudulent transfer. The judge, a woman named Judith Harmon who had grown up on a dairy farm in Ashland County and who still kept a vegetable garden behind her house, handed down a sentence that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Claire received 2 years in state prison, suspended to 18 months of supervised probation, 300 hours of community service, and a restitution lien against her future earnings for the full assessed value of the fraud, which the court calculated at $225,000. But Judge Harmon added a condition that made the entire gallery go silent. The community service was to be performed at my commercial kitchen facility, doing manual labor under my direct supervision, jar sterilization, label application, batch tracking, and quality control. The restitution lien would garnish any future income Claire earned from any source until the debt was fully repaid, and the court retained jurisdiction to impose the suspended prison time if she missed a single hour of service. I sat in the back row of that courtroom and felt something settle deep in my chest, not revenge, but a kind of earned, quiet completion. I changed the name of the sauce brand to Seeds of Betrayal Sauces because I have always believed in calling things by their true names. When the first commercial batch of mortgage lifter marinara went into production 6 weeks after the trial, Claire reported for her first day of community service dressed in clean jeans and a plain white shirt, trying to look as ordinary and penitent as possible. I met her at the loading dock door and handed her a canvas apron I had designed and screen-printed myself the week before. In crisp red letters across the chest, blocky and impossible to ignore, it reads "Rotten to the core." The probation officer on site, a patient woman named Rivera, nodded her approval, and Claire put the apron on without a word, her face a careful mask. I assigned her to the labeling station, where she stands for 4 hours at a stretch, rolling self-adhesive labels onto vacuum-sealed jars while I calibrate the thermal printer and the batch coder. Every single label that comes off that printer includes, just below the ingredients list and the nutrition panel, a single line in 8-point type: Probate Fraud Docket No. 2023 CV 004892, Court of Common Pleas, Licking County, Ohio. Below that, in a slightly larger font, the tagline reads, "Grown from seeds that refused to be sold." The first time I saw her holding a jar with her own crime printed on it, her fingers trembling just slightly, I felt a stillness inside me that I had not felt since before my father died. It was not anger, and it was not satisfaction, not exactly. It was the deep-rooted knowledge that my father's seeds were still growing, that his quiet countermeasure had held, and that I had harvested something from this whole ugly field that would nourish people for years to come. The restitution comes in small amounts, dripped from Claire's probation-mandated wages, a few $100s each month that I route directly back into the seed library's packaging budget and the climate-controlled storage unit where the mortgage lifter germplasm is now preserved. But the real restitution is something no check could ever represent. It is the legally immovable fact that the 50-50 partnership my father watched us sign in his kitchen is now 100% mine, cleared of every cloud and every forged claim, publicly shored by a trust that will outlast me and probably outlast everyone reading this story. I still do my own books, every single month, sitting at the same oak table where my father's blanket used to drag on the floor. I file a compliance report with the Greenbelt Seed Trust 4 times a year, and David Adler tells me the mortgage lifter accession is one of the most secure heirloom depositories in their entire vault system. When I walk the rows at my father's old plot, now expanded to a full 2 acres of trellised tomatoes, I can still see his hand in the shape of the leaves and the particular blue-green tint of the mortgage lifter foliage. I carry his note in my wallet, the one that said, "Trust the seeds." I carry a few of those 1998 seeds in a tiny glass vial around my neck. Sometimes the quietest roots hold the deepest truth. My father was a man who spoke in seasons and soil and the weight of a ripe fruit in his palm, but he saw the storm forming long before the first cloud showed on the horizon, and he planted a countermeasure in a paper packet sealed with red wax, tucked into a shoebox his enemies would dismiss as junk. It took me a year of living inside the storm to understand what he meant, but I understand it now with the clarity that only comes from having your life's work nearly stolen by someone you once taught to blanch tomatoes. Integrity is not a sign on a wall or a mission statement on a website. It is the seed you save when no one is looking, and it is the patch of ground you refuse to sell no matter who stands at the fence line holding a check and a smile and a piece of forged paper. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments below, because I know I'm not the only one who had to become an investigator in her own family, piecing together shredded paper and learning how to pick a lock at 62 years old. If this story stuck with you, hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Seeds don't plant themselves, and stories like this one don't grow without someone to listen. I'll see you in the next story.